Gary, welcome to the Humaniize Podcast. Very excited to have a chat with you today.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
Yes, no problem at all. Gary, why don't you start off by just introducing yourself a bit, telling the audience about your experience.
Okay, right. So now I am a full-time corporate trainer. So I cover different soft skills topic like storytelling, presentation skills, influencing, leadership, etc. The interesting thing about myself is I never started my career in training. So I actually start with multiple corporates. I started in marketing. After my MBA program, I did a bit of management consulting. So actually, after quite a few years of corporate, I decided to move to work for a university for quite a few years. And back in 2018, which is now like 4 years ago, I decided to just take a leap of faith, do something different, started my own training consultancy company. And here is where I am. And I happen to be meeting with you, Eric, just to share a little bit about my experience.
Yes, absolutely. So, Gary, one thing I was quite curious about is how you actually ended up as a trainer. So what prompted this career change from the marketing sector to talent management?
Yeah, so that's an interesting story because, to be honest, I graduated back at 2003, the year when SARS hit. So back at that time, if you were to ask me, oh, Gary, would you think about starting your own business, doing training? I would tell you absolutely no. So I basically started from a food company called Nestle, and then I moved on to pharmaceutical. I moved to a company called GSK. After that, I did my MBA program trying to accelerate my career. After I graduated, I went to Unilever, FMCG. Then I moved to a management consulting firm, which is something that I thought I would love to do after my MBA program. And then I also moved to tech. I worked for Apple for a bit. And then I also moved to LVMH, a luxury group. So if you kind of look at my profile, it's pretty interesting because it kind of feels like I don't really know what I want to do. But I think in a sense, when I was at the moment, I didn't overthink the process. I was just kind of going with the flow. These are all great companies. I was really grateful about the things I learned there, the opportunities, and just somehow every move just kind of came by when the right timing came. And then just after quite a few years of corporate, I think I have been pretty fortunate because a lot of them were really great companies. And you know that in your career, there's always this point you feel like, if I could work for that company, then things would be great. Things would be awesome. So including Apple is obviously a dream company of mine as a big Mac and iPhone fan before joining the company. And yeah, when you get there, you're kind of like, okay, now this is what it is. So what's next? So I think it's because exactly I've gone through all these different companies, all these kind of different industries. I kind of saw the world in a sense. And then I kind of felt like, okay, so maybe there's something more for me. So I think there came to a very unique opportunity is I mentioned before, I work for a university, which is exactly my MBA school here in Hong Kong, HKUST, the MBA program. So at that time, I think the background is before when I graduated, I was always a very active student ambassador. I always helped them do a lot of talks because I was really inspired and that really transformed my career in many ways. So at that time, just the previous head of mission just gave me a call and say, hey, Gary, you're always so passionate talking about the program, being our ambassador. How about doing this full time? So I said, oh, okay. I never thought about joining the university, but now given this role, given it's my alma mater, seems like it makes sense. So I just kind of took a leap of faith and gave it a try. And actually, if I look back at my career, that might be the most fulfilling time in my career because I really get to do a lot of interesting things. I think I get to have more impact about the things that I'm doing. And that's why when it came to another transition point, that kind of developed my interest and passion in terms of talent development. But definitely, I feel like I did not give up anything that I really acquired from marketing because I think starting my business, a big part was also in terms of how I marketed myself and positioned myself to be a more popular trainer in the market.
Yeah, that's a very interesting response. And related to that, have you experienced any slumps in your career life? And how did you overcome these slumps? So obviously, as a trainer who's worked with numerous major companies, related to the question I just asked, what do you think current graduates should focus on improving to really make themselves ready for corporate life?
Right. Slumps, yeah, for sure. I've worked for so many companies, so many different industries. And I think, number one, you need to just have the expectations that's just life, right? It's kind of like a story. There's going to be ups and downs. It's going to be a hero's journey. So you're going to now and then like deal with difficulties, challenges. So I think because the key thing I see for a lot of people who are not able to deal with it is because they're just sitting there and kind of asking themselves the why question. Okay, so why is this happening to me? Why we have these kind of things? Well, in my career, working for so many companies or kind of different transitions, including starting my business, I had a lot of challenges. I had a lot of downtime, and I just sit there and I just remind myself I have no time to ask why, because it has happened. And I think the key thing for moving on is when you move on from why to how, that actually makes a very big difference. So one example would be when I first started my business. Okay, that was a pretty tough transition because I was fortunate to work for all these great companies in the past. And honestly, that brand halo was enormous because whenever I go around, like people would respect to you, they would talk to you, they would feel interest in you because you have this company name at the back of your name card or the back of you. Okay. But now when you start your own company, you kind of all of a sudden, like in a way, you really kind of turn naked from a corporate profile point of view. Like no one knows you, no one have the same interest in you, and you really need to start from scratch. And I think sometimes it's even more difficult for someone like myself who makes this transition from corporate to this kind of entrepreneur journey, because I experienced what it was like before. It's not like, okay, I just graduated, I'm starting my business. So I think during that time is when I first started, like the first 6 months, I also got no business, right? Because I wasn't from training before. I didn't even know what I should be teaching. I don't know how to teach. So I was just kind of thinking about, okay, so how could I explore different things? So as versus just sitting there and asking myself, why? Like I have all this kind of corporate background. Why no one is hiring me as a trainer? Why no one is interested in my profile? I was just constantly asking myself the how question. So of course, just a short version of it, what I did was every single day in that 6 months, I was having like maybe 3 to 4 coffee chats with friends or connections around me, just asking them that question. Hey, I want to become a trainer. This is my profile. What do you think? Can you give me some advice and give me some suggestions? So yeah, during those few months, would I still kind of sometimes feel frustrated? Hey, why isn't my first job coming by? I would say definitely yes. But I think the key thing back to what I mentioned is shifting that why to that how mindset is, okay, if now I'm not getting my first job yet, then how can I make it happen? So I think consistently that process was actually very fundamental in terms of allowing me to kind of start a business or kind of in an expertise field that I was never in before.
Very interesting. And in one of your TEDx talks at HKU, you mentioned that the 4 key elements for gaining life momentum include curiosity, courage, passion, and gratefulness. And out of these 4 aspects, Gary, which elements do you think are the most lacking in the younger generation? Not to be too negative, but maybe you can provide some guidance there or some advice.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. And thanks for checking out my TEDx talk first, by the way. I would say I really don't want to kind of pinpoint the younger generation because I feel like the whole generation, like sometimes including myself, these are things that we would miss out. So yeah, I definitely see young people having these elements. I definitely saw like more mature people having these elements. But in general, okay, maybe from a perception point of view, because that might be a little bit different versus the reality. If I could speak for people like in my generation who have worked for like 20 years or more, I think in general, they feel like the younger generation lacks, number one, curiosity in a sense. I think it's more about the width, but not about the depth. Because, okay, I'm not sure if this is like the right way of looking into it is I feel like the younger generation, right? Because you guys were born with like technology, internet, all these kind of things. I feel like in a way you guys have a lot of curiosity because, right, you keep on searching on Google. It's not like back in my generation, I just sit in front of the TV and let them feed information to me. So I think in terms of knowledge wise, I think people would all recognize like the depth in terms of technical details, how much they know about a certain subject is great because, yeah, I feel like YouTube is like the best university in the world, right? You go there, you could pretty much search for all topics and you could spend years just studying all the content right there. But okay, on the flip side, if I think about it, especially now I'm pretty active on YouTube as well, obviously, is because a lot of search are generated by ourselves. So we tend to focus on like this topic, which I'm really interested in, but you don't get as much as like sometimes if I think about watching TV is exactly because those things are pretty random, right? It's not like Netflix, I need to choose this episode, that episode. They just kind of feed things to you. And sometimes you don't even know you're interested in those fields until you're exposed to it. So I think this is kind of like the benefit of watching TV. And honestly, like for the younger generation, I'm not sure how much time you still do that. So I think in general, to just kind of counter that is maybe like when you're doing YouTube, like as versus just searching art topics, because you definitely know like the algorithm of YouTube is the more you watch that, the more they feed you that kind of stuff. So I think it's more easy for us to kind of really live in a bubble in a sense and just kind of focus on that topic. So sometimes, like including myself, I would also remind myself, okay, yes, I'm on YouTube, but you could still go back to the general channel, which they would feed other stuff, which is also popular around the world. Like it might be something that Eric, you're looking for, right? So I think that's just a great way to broaden our perspective a little bit and also see the world. So I think that's about curiosity. The second thing I would say is gratefulness, like the final thing I talked about, which again, I wouldn't say this is something particularly a thing that is lacking for the younger generation, because I feel like the whole generation is kind of lacking this a bit, including myself. I also need to kind of always remind myself because, well, I would say we're very fortunate if you look into like the whole mankind history, like, yeah, now, of course, we're still having wars. We're in a very bad pandemic. But if you really look at the broader scope of things, I feel like people who were living in the planet like 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, well, obviously, our life is very different. So in a way, like in terms of like our wealth, technology, our entitlement, we're so used to these kind of things. And if you think about life, like it's not really about the absolute things that we have. It's about comparison, right? I'm used to this kind of lifestyle. So now I'm not having this. Then we start to kind of complain. We start to victimize ourselves. I think it always happens. So I think a really important thing is just to kind of remind ourselves, like whenever we have time, like I do the same, right? Sometimes when I'm very busy, like doing my training projects, I'll say, oh, why am I so busy? Why can't I just kind of take some time, sit there and just kind of watch some movies? Then of course I have to remind myself, right now, being able to do things that I want to do, still getting a lot of training projects during this pandemic time. Like there are a lot of things to be grateful for. And I think the key message is really gratefulness is really just a matter of choice. It's nothing right or wrong. Like there's nothing, you should be grateful or not be grateful. Is do you choose to be grateful in that certain situation by comparing to what could have gone worse and to people around you? And why do we want to remind ourselves of being grateful is because I think that positive energy that you have generated, because when we're grateful, we would never feel any kind of negative energy. And that's exactly the energy that you want to be bringing to people. And also as a trainer myself, that's what I need to remind myself. Yes, sometimes in a week, I might be teaching the same topic over and over again for 5 times a week, but I still remind myself it's a privilege and really a very fortunate opportunity for me to be able to do what I would like to do right now and to spread this knowledge. And potentially, like just like this podcast, right? If you listen to something right here, you feel like there's something that changed your life in a tiny little bit, that's definitely a blessing. So I definitely want to remind myself so I could also bring on that positive energy to more people around me.
Fantastic. That's a great mindset to have. And Gary, I was also curious, how do you stay in the loop with the ever-growing training industry? Because obviously this is an area where there is a lot of competition. And I think it's interesting getting some insight into, especially someone who has a lot of expertise with marketing. How do you stand out in this arena?
Yeah, I think one thing that helps me stand out is because I didn't come from the training industry, which at the beginning was very tough because, as I mentioned, I don't even know what people are looking for in terms of trainers. I don't know what other people are teaching. But I think exactly because I don't have those kind of burdens or these kind of things in the back of my mind, I could just do whatever I feel like is the most valuable. So I think once I started my business, my whole thinking was, what kind of training would I love to have when I was younger in the corporate? So that's exactly what I wanted to offer, because I was thinking, okay, if I could learn about these things back at those times, wow, that would significantly benefit my career and make me a better person. Right. So I think coming from that perspective, in a way that helped me stand out, because I know that maybe for some other trainers, because they had a lot of background, they have a lot of experience. So on the flip side is because you have all these kind of concepts, you feel like training has to be done in a certain way. So I think that has been one thing. And as I mentioned, I feel like in life, there are a lot of things that are happening, and really like they all contribute in a very different way, which especially when it comes down to this opportunity of having this marketing background, which I don't think a lot of trainers would have. And the key thing is, I think, like Eric, we're connected on LinkedIn, right? The way that I maybe position myself, the way that I talk about my things on LinkedIn, that would be very different. And obviously, if I was from the training field only and I didn't have any marketing background, I wouldn't be able to do so. So I think leveraging on that technology, and I would say, relatively speaking, I might be also one of the younger trainers in the market. So in a way, I think I could also better connect to the younger generation, which obviously is sometimes like the key target for a lot of companies.
Right, absolutely. And on a related note to that, so as a trainer who has worked with numerous major companies and various different individuals, what do you think current graduates should really be focusing on in terms of standing out in the job market, especially as someone who has worked for a lot of very coveted companies like Apple? I'm sure a lot of graduates would benefit from your insight, both as a trainer and then someone who has worked for these very prestigious companies.
Yeah, so I would say for employers, like pretty much they're looking for hard skills, soft skills. And comparatively speaking, I think from a perception point of view, or maybe a reality point of view, I think the younger generation are much more equipped on the hard skills. And I think no one could deny that, right? Even for the older generation, I know they rely a lot on the younger generation in terms of, okay, get this tech stuff fixed. You guys are better in terms of like maybe some of these kind of very specific subjects. But I think the soft skills is usually where people have a little bit more of the concerns. So that's why, like when I do training, one of the key topics I share is about storytelling and presentation skills.
Right.
So it is basically as simple as, now if there's something you want to be getting some buy-in, or you want to kind of convince someone, if I only gave you 3 minutes, how are you going to speak in front of the video and structure your content and present in a way that's convincing and also people feel like I could trust you? So obviously that is a very, very tough process, which takes a lot of training, a lot of thought behind that. And I would say, well, definitely out of a lot of courses out there, because I think the advantage right now nowadays is because there's so much content around the internet. There's going to be a lot of things you want to be talking about that. But if I look into my career, right, we always have a topic about personal branding, which is, I would put it this way, is when you ask your colleagues around you, or maybe the interviewer, okay, after meeting you for, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes, if I had to describe you in 3 words, what would those 3 words be? Okay, if you're watching the podcast, I would definitely recommend you to kind of think about that thing, because when I was younger, I never thought about these things. Right. And honestly, when I was older, I always think back, like when we complain about the younger generation, which I'll be honest, every generation would be complaining about the younger generation. That's just kind of like an ego thing, because we want to feel better about ourselves, right? I'm pretty sure if now you're young, when you get older, you might also be complaining about the younger generation. But the key thing is perception counts, right? Because when you work in a big organization, like just some of the corporates I worked before, no one is working next to you like 24 hours a day. No one really know what you are doing every single moment. So it comes down to, okay, now I'm meeting with Eric. Now he has this like 5-minute presentation and update about his function or his business. How does he structure that message, and how does he carry himself in front of the camera? That 5 minutes will pretty much determine your career at that point in time. Because I sometimes want to kind of put it in a more direct way. At the end of the day, for a corporate to decide someone to get promoted, yeah, they kind of put it in a more structured or kind of like a scientific way. But really, it comes down to, let's say if myself and Eric were the management team, you kind of look at the profile of this guy, David, and you say, oh, what do you think about David? Oh, yeah, David, last time he made a virtual presentation, I thought that was pretty impressive. Sometimes it really comes down to that part. Well, of course, I don't want to kind of oversimplify, because there's a lot of other elements to it as well. But really being able to capture that moment in terms of like just presenting yourself, I would say no single thing in your career is more transforming as versus, okay, today I have a perception about you. And let's say next week, you suddenly totally transform your way of making your presentation. Your story was a lot more precise. Message was much more crispy. The way that you present yourself was a lot more confident. People would basically change their perception about you overnight. Yeah. So I feel like if for the younger generation, you guys have so much knowledge. You guys are so good in terms of like hard skills and tech skills. Definitely try to polish a little bit more in terms of the way that we're presenting ourselves to give people that kind of confidence.
Yeah, that's great. I think a lot of people should think more about that personal branding, even if they are within a much larger, more traditional entity. I think that's always something that's very important. I think it's something that's probably neglected by a lot of people when they work in a more traditional capacity. And finally, Gary, I'm quite interested to know what your advice is for graduates or people in general who are looking to start their career in the corporate training industry.
Okay. Great question, Eric. So I'm trying to relate that because, like, honestly, when I first graduated, I never thought about being in the training field. But the good news is I think the training field is a lot more developed nowadays because all employers are more concerned about retaining their talent. And obviously, I think training development serves a big part in terms of like not only employer branding, but really showing their commitment of developing their people. And I would say if you're really interested in the field is number one, you want to make sure you have the right intentions. Okay. So the right intentions, I mean, like, because when you're doing training, it's not like my previous marketing job, sales job, operations job, you're just sitting behind a computer. You really need to interact with people every single day and people kind of feel you, they listen to your message. So when I talk about intention is you really want to make an impact and a difference to other people when you're doing this. So it's not just another job, right? Because if I'm just working on Excel PowerPoints, okay, great. If this is just another job, I could just kind of put on that state and do that stuff. Right. But now, like as a trainer, when I train like 5 days a week, I always need to kind of put on a certain state that I could convince other people, because being able to hold a group like for 8 hours, 4 hours, it's not a very easy thing. So I think it really comes down to an intention, because people could feel you. Like, why is this trainer in front of me? Is he just doing this as a job? Does he just want to finish the class, just cover whatever he has on a PowerPoint? Or does he really want to make a difference to my life? So I think that makes a huge difference. It's a difference and also a great differentiator versus more successful trainers versus, I think, more average trainers. And the second thing is, I think from a career background point of view, because I also had some young people talking to me saying that, oh, Gary, I'm really interested in the training field. Should I get a job in the training field right away? I would say yes and no. Okay, of course, there's going to be good joining the training field, because when you start from like learning and development, you get to learn more about talent development. You get to meet with a lot of great trainers. I think it's a great learning process, right? I wish I had that as well. But on the flip side, if you think about it, like the reality is I look at a lot of trainers on the market. Usually they would also like someone who actually had the experience working in core functions in the corporate, such as like marketing, sales, operations. So just think about it, right? If now you happen to be a young employee in the company, would you want a CEO of a certain company to train you about leadership? Or would you want someone who just came from the training field that they taught leadership for a long time to talk about leadership?
Right.
So I think most people would agree they might prefer the former, just because people like that practical and actual experience. So I think the good news for most people is, if even though, okay, in the longer term, you might feel like, oh, Gary, your career is pretty interesting. Maybe I also want to start my business as a trainer. That doesn't mean you have to stick to the training field for your whole career. You could just do whatever you love, whatever you like, and just be good and be great at it. And as long as you're able to do so, like if you happen to be the marketing director of a certain prestigious company, I see no reason why other companies won't want to be learning from you, because you have proven yourself with your track record. So, okay, the other thing about being in that training field is also, of course, you might want to kind of gather a little bit more experience before this. So I just might end this by one advice I've given to one of the students before is, this person, he just finished his MBA degree from a very prestigious school. He really wanted to be in a training field. So he said, okay, Gary, what you're doing is great. I really want to kind of be doing this. So at that time, actually, my advice for him is, if you want to do what I'm doing right now, please don't get into the training field right now. Why? Because if now you're that young, that person has been working for like 4 to 5 years. If you go into the training field, like, you need to foresee who you're going to become in 10 years time, right? 15 years later, if you're still in like a training department, I'm not sure. You might be very successful in some sorts of training, but for some parts, you also might be more limited. So my other question for him is, now let's say 15 years later, you happen to be a very young person who just graduated joining this company. If you could join a training, who would be the ideal candidate to train you? Then he said, well, yeah, maybe the managing director of that bank, because he was in the banking industry. I said, great. So if you want to become that person, then work hard and try to become the managing director of that bank, because that's exactly how your future participants in your class would perceive you as well.
Interesting. Yeah. It's always great to be very intentional about where you want to end up and how you're going to get there. Exactly. So that's an interesting way of thinking about going about getting into the corporate training industry. And Gary, any final words or comments to the audience?
Again, also something that I remind myself is just be grateful for everything I think we have in this current world in terms of like the relationship next to you, also the technology and all the stuff that we have available in this generation, which we didn't have before. And I would say, especially if I think about it, if I'm the younger generation, I just graduated right now, definitely tap into more of your strengths, which you guys would have a lot, is in terms of like the leverage that you could be creating through the internet. So I think it's great because Eric, like we never met before. You just reached me out through LinkedIn and we're having this kind of conversation, which I think is wonderful. And if you think about it, like when it was time back when I graduated like 20 years ago, this could never kind of happen. So I think if you have all these kind of tools around us, definitely think about how we could be leveraging this. And of course, if you happen to be more of the fortunate ones that you already have a pretty stable wealth status at home, then really think about how we could be contributing more to other people. Yeah, because you never know. Like for your older generation, maybe your mom, your dad, they might be too busy just working to kind of make sure that the family is running. We have enough money to kind of get your lunch and get your dinner. So now if you happen to have those conditions in place, really think about how to be leveraging on all the resources we have, make more contribution to the world. Because right now, I feel like what we need more is not resources, is really, I think, a positive mentality and more positive energy.
Absolutely. Great final comment. And thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today, Gary. I'm sure the audience will benefit greatly from it. And we look forward to having you on the Humaniiize Podcast again in the future.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you so much.